I never thought I would be sitting here, in the study of a house that nearly wasn't mine anymore, writing down the story of how my own brother tried to destroy everything I had ever built. But here I am, and I suppose if I'm going to tell this story properly, I need to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the betrayal, though that came earlier than I ever realized, but the beginning of when I finally opened my eyes and saw my brother Marcus for who he truly was. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when the first domino fell, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. The kind of gray, drizzly London evening that makes you grateful for central heating and a warm family waiting at home. I had just finished a meeting with a potential investor for our latest development project, a converted warehouse in Bermondsey that we were turning into luxury flats. The meeting had gone well. Handshakes all around, verbal commitments that felt solid. I remember driving home feeling that particular satisfaction that comes from knowing your hard work is paying off. My company, Matthews Property Development, wasn't a massive corporation. We weren't competing with the big London developers, but over 18 years I had built something real, something that employed 47 people and had completed over 200 projects across the south of England. Every brick, every contract, every relationship had been earned through long hours, calculated risks, and a reputation for honest dealing that I protected fiercely. When I pulled into the driveway of our home in Richmond, I noticed Marcus's car already parked there. This wasn't unusual. My brother had been working for me for the past 6 years, ever since his last business venture had collapsed and left him nearly bankrupt. I had given him a position as Director of Client Relations, a title that perhaps overstated his responsibilities, but gave him the dignity I knew he needed. He was good with people. I had to admit that. Clients liked him. He had our mother's easy charm, the ability to make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. I found him in the kitchen with Sarah, my wife, and the children. Emma was showing him something on her tablet, probably one of her drawings. She had inherited my methodical nature, but applied it to art rather than business. Jack was doing his homework at the kitchen table, or at least pretending to while actually listening to the adult conversation. "Danny!" Marcus stood up and clasped my shoulder. In that way he had, somewhere between a hug and a handshake. "Good meeting." "Very good, actually. Harrison's coming on board. Should have the paperwork signed by end of week." "Brilliant. That's the Bermondsey project sorted then." He grinned, and I remember thinking how well he looked. He'd been hitting the gym, had a bit of a tan despite the November gloom. Claire must have taken him somewhere sunny recently. Sarah caught my eye over his shoulder and gave me that small smile that meant she was happy to see me. 15 years of marriage, and that smile still worked on me every time. She was the foundation everything else was built on, though I didn't tell her that often enough. "Stay for dinner?" she asked Marcus. "Can't tonight, I'm afraid. Claire's got something planned. Just stop by to drop off those contracts for Danny to sign." He nodded toward a folder on the counter. "Routine stuff. The Henderson account renewals and some supplier agreements." I picked up the folder, flipping through it briefly. Standard documentation. Nothing that required detailed scrutiny. Marcus had been handling these for years without issue. "I'll look through them tonight," I said. "No rush." "Well, there's a bit of rush on the Henderson ones. They want them back by Thursday." "Fine. I'll prioritize those." He left shortly after, and the evening settled into its comfortable routine. Dinner with the family, helping Jack with his maths homework, which he absolutely did not need given that he was far better at it than I'd ever been, and then settling into my study to review the paperwork. I signed the Henderson renewals without much thought. They had been clients for 8 years, reliable, always paid on time. The supplier agreements were similarly straightforward. I initialed pages, signed where marked, and placed them back in the folder for Marcus to collect the next day. That was my first mistake, though I wouldn't realize it for another 3 months. The winter passed in the usual blur of work and family. Christmas at our house with my mother, Marcus, and Claire. Sarah had outdone herself with the decorations and the meal. I remember watching Marcus charm my mother as he always did, making her laugh with stories from his university days that had grown more embellished with each retelling. Claire sat quietly beside him, and I noticed Sarah exchanging glances with her throughout the evening. Women's intuition, I would later think, picking up on things we men are too oblivious to see. The Bermondsey project was progressing well. Harrison's investment had unlocked the financing we needed, and construction was on schedule. I was spending more time on site than usual, enjoying the hands-on aspect of the work that I'd somewhat drifted away from as the company grew. There's something satisfying about watching a building take shape, knowing you're creating homes where families will live, spaces where lives will unfold. Marcus was handling the office side of things in my absence, and by all accounts, doing it well. The staff seemed happy. Client relationships were solid, our quarterly numbers were strong. If anything, I was feeling guilty about how much I'd underestimated him over the years. Maybe he had finally found his footing. Maybe working in a structured environment, rather than trying to run his own show, was what he'd needed all along. It was early March when Robert Chen first raised his concerns. Robert had been my accountant since the early days, one of the few people who'd believed in me when I was just a kid from Manchester with big dreams and no money. We had lunch together at least once a month, a tradition that had survived 18 years of business growth. We were at our usual place, a quiet Italian restaurant near his office in the city, when he set down his fork with unusual deliberateness. "Danny, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to not react until I've finished." I felt a small flutter of unease. Robert was not given to dramatics. "All right, I've been going through the accounts for the annual audit, and there are some irregularities I can't explain." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Money moving in patterns that don't match our normal operations. Supplier payments that don't correspond to any invoices I can find. Small amounts, individually, but they add up." "How much are we talking?" "Over the past 18 months, approximately £340,000. I set down my own fork. "That's not possible. I review the monthly statements myself." "I know you do. That's what's puzzling me. The statements you're seeing are accurate in terms of our overall position. But there are transactions buried in the details that shouldn't be there. Payments to companies I've never heard of, for services I can't verify. Are you saying someone's stealing from me?" Robert's expression told me everything his words hadn't. "I'm saying there are discrepancies I can't explain, and you need to investigate them properly before I can finalize the audit." I spent the rest of that week going through the accounts with Robert. What we found was subtle, sophisticated, and would have been nearly impossible to detect if Robert hadn't been as meticulous as he was. Payments to shell companies for consulting services that had never been rendered. Supplier invoices that were legitimate documents from legitimate companies, but for amounts slightly higher than the actual goods delivered. The difference, always paid in cash, simply disappearing. The signing authority on all of these transactions was mine, my signature, on documents I didn't remember signing, documents that looked exactly like the routine paperwork Marcus brought me regularly. I didn't want to believe it. I spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find another explanation. A rogue employee with access to my signature stamp, perhaps, or a sophisticated external fraud. But the more I dug, the more the evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The shell companies were registered to a Claire Matthews, my brother's wife. I remember the moment that reality fully landed. I was alone in my study, well past midnight, staring at company registration documents on my computer screen. My brother, the person I had protected and defended my entire life, the person I had given a second chance when no one else would, had been systematically stealing from me for over a year. The question that kept me awake wasn't how. I understood the mechanics now. It was why. I paid Marcus well. Certainly more than his position warranted if I was being honest. He had a nice house, a comfortable life. What could possibly justify this betrayal? I didn't confront him immediately. That was perhaps the hardest thing I've ever done, maintaining a facade of normalcy while my world crumbled underneath me. But I knew, even through the fog of hurt and anger, that I needed to understand the full scope of what he'd done before I made any moves. If I tipped him off, he might cover his tracks, destroy evidence, or simply disappear with whatever he'd taken. So I watched, and I waited. And I learned things about my brother that made the theft seem almost minor in comparison. The first revelation came through Claire, though she didn't know she was the source. Sarah had invited her over for coffee one Saturday when Marcus and I were supposedly meeting with contractors. I had actually canceled my part of the meeting, claiming a headache, and was working in my study when I heard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The study was adjacent to the kitchen, and their voices carried through the thin walls of our Victorian terrace. But once I heard my name, I couldn't help but listen. "He's been so stressed lately," Claire was saying. "Coming home at all hours, barely sleeping. I don't know what's going on." "Has he said anything?" Sarah asked. "Only that there's a big opportunity he's working on, something that's going to change everything for us." Claire's voice dropped. "Sometimes I wonder if there's someone else." "Marcus, I can't imagine him. You didn't see him last month. He bought a new watch, a Rolex, said it was for a client meeting. But Danny, he doesn't even meet with clients alone. He told me that himself." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. A Rolex? Marcus's salary wouldn't cover a Rolex, not with their mortgage and Claire's part-time income. I knew that because I'd helped him refinance 2 years ago when they were struggling. The money he was stealing, was he spending it on watches? What else? "Men buy themselves things sometimes," Sarah said diplomatically. "For £12,000? Without telling me?" The conversation moved on to other topics, but I'd heard enough. That evening, I began to truly investigate my brother's life. Not just his access to my accounts. What I found would eventually fill a dossier, 3 inches thick. Marcus had been gambling. Not casually, not socially, but seriously and badly. Online poker sites, sports betting, casino visits in Mayfair. He owed money to people who weren't banks, the kind of people who didn't send polite letters about missed payments. The theft from my company had been, at least initially, an attempt to cover those debts. But somewhere along the way, greed had taken over. Or maybe it wasn't greed at all. Maybe it was something darker, something that had been festering since we were children. I found emails on a backup server we shared for company files. Emails that Marcus had clearly thought were deleted, that spoke of me in terms I'd never imagined my brother using. The golden boy, Dad's favorite. Everything always comes so easy for him. There were conversations with friends I'd never met, complaints about how I treated him like an employee rather than a brother, how I lorded my success over him, how I deliberately kept him in a subordinate position to feel superior. None of it was true. I had given Marcus every opportunity. I had covered his debts twice. I had created a role for him that paid twice what the market would bear for someone with his experience. I had welcomed him into my home, trusted him with my children, defended him to Sarah when she expressed doubts about his reliability. And all that time, he had been stealing from me and resenting me for my success. The emails got worse. Plans. Not just to steal money, but to eventually force me out of my own company. Marcus had been cultivating relationships with my investors behind my back, suggesting that I was losing my edge, that the company needed new leadership. He'd been planting seeds of doubt about my financial decisions, my strategic vision, even my mental stability. There was one email to a man I didn't recognize that made my blood run cold. Once we have enough evidence of his mismanagement, the board will have to act. I'll be positioned as the logical successor. Claire's companies have enough of our money to finance a buyout of his shares at a discount. This time next year, Matthew's property development will be mine, and Danny won't even know what hit him. My brother wasn't just stealing from me. He was planning to take everything I had built. I sat with this knowledge for 2 weeks before I told anyone. Those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. I went to work, interacted with Marcus as though nothing had changed, signed papers he brought me while secretly photographing every document, and came home to my family with a smile that must have looked genuine because no one questioned it. But inside, I was being torn apart. This was Marcus, my little brother, the boy who'd followed me everywhere when we were children, who'd cried when I left for university, who'd called me first when his own ventures failed. How could the same person be capable of such calculated betrayal? I finally told Sarah on a Sunday night after the children were asleep. I told her I needed to talk about something important, and something in my tone must have alarmed her because she sat down immediately, all pretense of tidying up abandoned. I told her everything, the missing money, the shell companies, the gambling debts, the emails. By the time I finished, she was crying, and I realized it wasn't just shock or sympathy. It was validation. I knew something was wrong, she said. I've known for months. The way he looks at you sometimes when you're not watching. And Claire has said things, odd comments about how different your lives are, how unfair it is that some people have everything while others struggle. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? That I thought your brother was jealous? Everyone's jealous of someone. I didn't think... She stopped, shaking her head. I didn't think he would do this. What do I do now? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was harder than I'd ever heard it. You make sure he can never hurt you or this family again, whatever that takes. I began building my case the next morning. Robert introduced me to a forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who had worked with the Serious Fraud Office on corporate theft cases. She was expensive, but within 2 weeks, she had documented everything with a precision that was almost beautiful in its thoroughness. The total theft was larger than Robert's initial estimate, £473,000 over 18 months, all of it traceable through the maze of shell companies back to accounts controlled by Marcus and Claire. But more importantly, Patricia had documented the pattern in a way that made the intent undeniable. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a systematic, ongoing scheme designed to both enrich my brother and weaken my company. Graham Whitfield, my solicitor, reviewed the evidence and confirmed what I already knew. This was criminal fraud, potentially carrying a prison sentence of several years, but he also warned me of the complexities involved. He's your brother, Daniel. A jury will want to know why you're sending your own family to prison. They'll look for some explanation beyond mere theft. A family dispute, perhaps, or previous bad blood. Marcus's lawyers will almost certainly try to paint this as a civil matter between brothers, not a criminal enterprise. Is there a way to avoid that? You could pursue it civilly, yes. Sue for recovery of the funds and damages. It would be less public, potentially less painful for your mother and the rest of the family. But the penalties would be financial only. He wouldn't face prison time. I thought about that option. It would be cleaner, certainly, less likely to tear our family permanently apart. My mother was nearly 70, with a heart condition that worsened with stress. The idea of her watching one son testify against another in a criminal trial was almost unbearable. But then I thought about those emails, the contempt in his words, the careful planning, the intention to take not just money, but my life's work. And I thought about what he would do if he got away with it, how emboldened he would be, how likely to try again with someone else. I want the criminal case, I said, but I want to do it right. I want him to know exactly what he's done, and I want him to face real consequences. Graham nodded slowly. Then we'll need to do this carefully. You'll need to gather more evidence, ideally something that shows his intent clearly, in his own words if possible. The emails are good, but a defense attorney will claim they're being misinterpreted. You need something unambiguous. That was when I started wearing a wire. The technology these days is remarkable. A small device, no larger than a button, that can record hours of high-quality audio without detection. Graham connected me with a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud cases, a former police detective named Ian Morrison. He showed me how to use the equipment, coached me on how to steer conversations toward incriminating topics without being obvious about it. Your brother doesn't suspect you know, Ian said. That's your biggest advantage. He's confident, probably getting cocky. People like him, they eventually can't resist talking about how clever they've been. You just need to give him the opportunity. I created that opportunity a week later, on a Wednesday evening when Sarah had taken the children to visit her parents. I invited Marcus over for a drink. Just the two of us, something we hadn't done in months. He seemed surprised, but pleased, and arrived with a bottle of expensive whiskey I suspected had been bought with my money. We sat in my living room, and I let him talk. About the business, about his plans for the future, about Claire. I asked questions that suggested I was considering semi-retirement, perhaps bringing in new partners to reduce my workload. His eyes lit up at that, and I saw it then, the hunger, the calculation. He leaned forward, dropping his voice as though sharing a secret. You know, Danny, I've been thinking about that myself. You've been working so hard for so long. You deserve to enjoy what you've built, and the company, well, it's running itself now, isn't it? The systems are in place. The team is solid. I wouldn't say running itself exactly, but close enough. Look, I wasn't going to bring this up, but there's been some talk among the investors. Nothing negative, don't worry. Just, well, questions about the future. What happens if something happens to you? Succession planning, you know. And what do you tell them? Marcus smiled, and there was something almost predatory in it. I tell them that I'm here, that I understand the business, that I've been learning from the best for 6 years. He raised his glass. To family, eh? Taking care of each other? I clinked my glass against his, feeling sick. To family. The conversation continued, and slowly, carefully, I drew him out. I expressed concerns about certain financial irregularities I'd just noticed, and watched his face for any flicker of alarm. There was none. He was utterly confident in his deception. Those are just standard discrepancies, he assured me. You know how it is with suppliers? A few pounds here and there, rounding errors in the accounting. I wouldn't worry about it. The amount seemed quite large for rounding errors. Really? He looked thoughtful, playing his part perfectly. I can look into it if you like. Probably just some lazy bookkeeping from the accounting team. I'll sort it out. Would you? That would be helpful. Of course. That's what I'm here for. He left that evening with another bottle of whiskey, extracted from my collection, and a promise to investigate the very fraud he had committed. I sat in the empty living room for a long time after he'd gone, the recording device heavy in my pocket, wondering how we had come to this. I gathered more recordings over the following weeks, conversations in the office, in restaurants, in my car, as I drove him to meetings. Marcus never openly admitted to the theft, but he said enough to damn himself. Comments about money being tight for other people, but never for him. Observations about how easy it was to manipulate accounting systems if you knew what you were doing. And once, in a moment of whiskey-fueled candor, a confession that he'd always known he was smarter than me, that our father had just been too blind to see it. Dad gave you everything, he said that night. We were at a bar in Mayfair, the kind of place he couldn't have afforded on his own. The attention, the approval, the faith. I was just the spare, the backup in case the golden boy didn't work out. That's not how I remember it. Of course it isn't. You were too busy being perfect to notice what it was like for the rest of us. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what he said to me? When I told him I was starting my first business, he said, "Are you sure you know what you're doing? Maybe you should talk to Daniel first." First business, first failure, and already I was living in your shadow. He was just trying to help. He was telling me I wasn't good enough, Not compared to you. Marcus finished his drink and signaled for another. Well, I've proved him wrong now, haven't I? Everything I've done at the company, the client relationships I've built, the growth we've seen, that's me. Not you, sitting in your office crunching numbers. Me. I recorded all of it. Every bitter word, every self-justifying rationalization, every glimpse into the resentment that had apparently been building for our entire lives. And when I had enough, I took it all to Ian Morrison, who added it to the mountain of evidence Patricia had compiled. This is solid, he said, reviewing the transcripts. Combined with the financial documentation, any prosecutor would be eager to take this case. But are you sure this is what you want? Once you file charges, there's no going back. Your relationship with your brother, whatever remains of it, will be over. It's already over, I said. He ended it the first time he forged my signature. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Part of me still hoped there was some explanation I was missing, some circumstance that would make sense of what Marcus had done. Maybe he had been coerced. Maybe the gambling addiction had overwhelmed his judgment. Maybe, if I confronted him directly, he would break down and confess, and we could find a way through this together. It was Sarah who convinced me not to give him that chance. You're looking for the brother you remember, she said. The boy who followed you around, who looked up to you, but that boy is gone, Danny. Maybe he was never really there. The man who did this to you, he planned it for months, maybe years. He looked you in the eye every day and lied. He was going to take your company, your life's work, and leave you with nothing. And if you give him warning, if you confront him before the evidence is in the hands of the authorities, he will find a way to turn it around. He'll make himself the victim and you the villain. That's what people like him do. She was right. I knew she was right, but it still felt like a betrayal of my own, closing that final door on any possibility of reconciliation. I filed the criminal complaint on a Thursday in late May. The timing was deliberate. Graham had advised me that filing midweek, rather than on a Friday, would give the authorities time to act before Marcus had a weekend to potentially flee or destroy evidence. We had also prepared civil litigation to run parallel to the criminal case, seeking recovery of the stolen funds plus damages. The police arrested Marcus at his home early the following Tuesday. Claire called me, hysterical, at 7 in the morning. "What have you done?" she screamed into the phone. "There are police everywhere. They're taking him away? What is happening? Claire, I think you should talk to a lawyer." "A lawyer? Danny, what is going on? They're saying something about fraud, about stolen money. This is insane. You know Marcus would never—" "The evidence is clear, Claire. I'm sorry." There was a long silence on the line. When she spoke again, her voice was small, frightened. "The companies, the ones in my name. He said they were for tax planning. I know what he said. I didn't know. Danny, I swear, I didn't know what he was doing with them." "Then you need to tell the police that. And you need to find a lawyer who can help you prove it." I hung up, feeling no satisfaction, only exhaustion. Whatever came next, however justified my actions were, the fallout would be devastating. My mother, my relationship with Claire, my own sense of who my brother was, all of it would be casualties of the truth. The next 3 months were a slow-motion nightmare. Marcus was released on bail, with conditions that included surrendering his passport and having no contact with me or any employees of Matthews Property Development. His lawyer immediately began the expected counterattack, filing motions to dismiss the case, suggesting the evidence had been obtained improperly, hinting that this was a family dispute being weaponized through the legal system. The press picked up the story, as Graham had warned they might. Property developer accuses brother of fraud made headlines in the business sections, though fortunately the tabloids found it too complicated and bloodless to pursue. Still, I found myself the subject of unwelcome attention, questions from clients and investors, subtle scrutiny from everyone who had ever known us as brothers. My mother called me 3 days after the arrest. I had been expecting the call, dreading it, rehearsing what I would say. Nothing prepared me for the reality. "How could you do this to him?" She was crying, her voice thick with accusation. "Your own brother, Daniel, your flesh and blood." "Mom, he stole almost £500,000 from me. He was planning to take my company." "Money? You're sending your brother to prison over money? We raised you better than that. It's not just money. It's what he was going to do. What he was still doing, right up until the police arrested him. There must be some explanation. Marcus wouldn't do this. He loves you." I wanted to laugh at that. I wanted to cry. Instead, I just felt empty. "He doesn't love me, Mom. I don't know if he ever did. The things he said about me, about Dad, about our family, I don't want to hear it. Whatever he said, whatever he did, you could have handled this differently. You could have talked to him. You could have helped him. I tried to help him. For years I tried. I gave him a job when no one else would hire him. I paid his debts. I welcomed him into my home. And he repaid me by stealing from me and plotting to destroy everything I'd built. There was silence on the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. I have 2 sons. Right now, I'm not sure I want to speak to either of them. She hung up, and I sat in my office, staring at the phone for what felt like hours. Sarah found me there later, still holding the receiver, and gently took it from my hand. "She'll come around," she said, "when she sees the evidence, when she understands what really happened." "Will she? Marcus was always her favorite. She'll find a way to blame me for this." Sarah didn't argue, and her silence was its own answer. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for September. Graham was confident about our case, but warned me that the trial itself, if it came to that, would be grueling. "Marcus's defense is going to argue that you entrapped him," he explained. "Those recordings you made, they'll say you led him into making statements that sound incriminating, but were actually taken out of context. They'll paint a picture of a jealous older brother who couldn't stand to see his siblings succeed. That's absurd. Of course it is, but it's the only defense they have, so they'll pursue it aggressively. You need to be prepared for your character to be attacked. Every business decision you've ever made, every disagreement you've ever had with Marcus, it's all fair game. I was prepared for the attack. What I wasn't prepared for was where the ammunition would come from." 2 weeks before the hearing, I received a call from a journalist named Helen Marsh. She worked for a financial paper I'd occasionally been interviewed by, and her tone was carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Mr. Matthews, I'm working on a story about your brother's case. I was hoping you might comment on some documents we've received." "What documents?" "Emails, primarily, between you and various investors, discussing your plans for the company's future. Some of them seem to suggest that you were looking to push your brother out of the business long before the alleged fraud was discovered." I felt my blood turn cold. "That's not true. I don't know what emails you're referring to, but I can read you some excerpts if that would help refresh your memory." She did, and as she read, I realized what had happened. The emails were real, but they'd been edited. Sentences spliced together from different messages, context stripped away to create implications that hadn't existed in the originals. A discussion about restructuring roles to improve efficiency became a plot to marginalize my brother. A casual comment about Marcus's lack of experience became evidence of my contempt for him. "Those emails have been manipulated," I said. "I can provide you with the original documents, with full metadata showing when they were sent and what they actually said." "I would appreciate that, but you should know, Mr. Matthews, that these documents were provided by a source who claims to have worked closely with you. Someone who says they have evidence that you've been systematically defrauding your investors for years, and that the charges against your brother are part of a cover-up." I knew then, with absolute certainty, that Marcus had planned for this. Even from his position of apparent helplessness, he was still fighting, still scheming, still trying to destroy me. "Who is your source?" "I'm not at liberty to say." "Then I suggest you verify their claims very carefully before you print anything, because what you're describing is defamation, and I will not hesitate to pursue legal remedies." I spent the next 48 hours in damage control mode. Graham filed an emergency motion to prevent the tampered documents from being used in the hearing. Patricia went back through our records to create a definitive trail, showing exactly where the emails had been altered. And Robert, dear reliable Robert, tracked down the source of the leak. It was someone I'd never suspected. Thomas Whitmore, my IT manager, had been feeding Marcus information for over a year. They'd known each other from university, a connection Thomas had never disclosed when I'd hired him. In exchange for copies of my emails and access to company systems, Marcus had been paying him from the funds he'd stolen from me, the betrayal within the betrayal. I was beginning to understand how deep the rot went. Thomas was fired immediately, and Graham added him to the criminal complaint. The journalist, to her credit, killed the story once she saw the evidence of manipulation. But the damage to my peace of mind was done. If I couldn't trust my own employees, if my brother's influence extended into every corner of my life, how could I ever feel safe again? The preliminary hearing went better than I'd feared. The judge reviewed the evidence, heard arguments from both sides, and ruled that there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Marcus was bound over, his bail conditions tightened, and a trial date was set for January. Graham called it a significant victory. I called it the end of the beginning. The months between the hearing and the trial were a strange limbo. Life continued, in the way it does even when everything feels suspended. Emma turned 13 and wanted a party at a trampoline park, which I organized with the kind of forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. Jack made the school football team, and I attended every match, grateful for something uncomplicated to focus on. Work was more difficult. The publicity around the case had made some investors nervous, and I spent countless hours in meetings reassuring people that the company was sound, that the theft had been contained, that our fundamentals were strong. Most of them believed me. A few quietly reduced their exposure, and I couldn't blame them. The Bermondsey project was completed on schedule, and the flat sold well. I should have felt triumph. But it was muted, shadowed by everything else. Success meant nothing if my brother could simply take it away. I saw Marcus only once during this period, by accident, at our mother's house. I had gone to deliver some documents she'd asked for, estate papers she was updating with a new solicitor. I didn't know he would be there, and from the look on his face, he hadn't expected me either. We stood in our mother's hallway, two men who shared blood and nothing else, and stared at each other. "Danny," his voice was careful, neutral. "Marcus, I don't suppose there's any chance we could talk about this. Privately, I mean, without lawyers." "No, I'm not asking you to drop the case. I just think if we could understand each other." "I understand you perfectly." The words came out harder than I intended. "You stole from me. You lied to me. You tried to take everything I'd built. There's nothing to discuss." "That's not—" He stopped himself, looked away. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I made mistakes. I'm not denying that. But you don't know what it's been like for me all these years. Watching you succeed at everything while I struggled. Seeing Mom compare us, Dad compare us, everyone compare us. You were always the one who got it right, the one who deserved good things. So you decided to take them instead. I deserved something too." The mask slipped, just for a moment, and I saw the rage underneath. "You had everything, Danny. Everything. The business, the family, the money, the respect. And what did I have? A job you gave me out of pity. A wife who knew I'd never be as successful as my brother. A mother who still talks about you like you're some kind of saint. You had choices. You could have built your own success. You could have asked for help. Instead, you chose to steal. You would never have given me what I needed. Not really. You like having me beneath you. It makes you feel good about yourself." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my brother's face, and realized that nothing I said would change anything. He had constructed a narrative in which he was the victim, I was the villain, and his actions were justified. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about envy, so deep it had rotted him from the inside. "Goodbye, Marcus." I left without seeing my mother and drove home in a daze of something that felt almost like grief. The brother I remembered, the one who'd made me laugh and driven me crazy in equal measure, that brother was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed. Maybe I'd been loving an illusion all along. The trial began on a cold Monday in January. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, more ordinary. There were no dramatic speeches, no gasps from the gallery, just a methodical presentation of evidence, witness after witness laying out the facts of what Marcus had done. I testified on the second day. Graham had prepared me thoroughly, but nothing could fully prepare anyone for the experience of telling a room full of strangers how your own brother had betrayed you. I spoke for nearly 3 hours, answering questions about our history, our business relationship, my discovery of the fraud, and the evidence I'd gathered. The prosecution led me through the timeline with careful precision, while Marcus's defense attorney tried to find contradictions, inconsistencies, anything to undermine my credibility. "Isn't it true, Mr. Matthews, that you've always resented your brother's presence in your company?" "No, that's not true." "Then why did you refer to him in an email as a necessary complication?" "That email was taken out of context. I was discussing the challenges of working with family, not expressing resentment toward Marcus specifically." "And when you secretly recorded conversations with your brother, wasn't that an attempt to entrap him?" "No, it was an attempt to document what was happening after I discovered the fraud." "You didn't consider simply confronting him, having an honest conversation with your own brother?" "I considered it, but the evidence suggested he was too deeply involved to admit what he'd done, and I had a responsibility to my employees, my investors, and my family to handle this properly." The defense attorney tried other angles, suggesting I had been jealous of Marcus's rapport with clients, threatened by his growing influence in the company, motivated by some old sibling rivalry to destroy him. None of it stuck, because none of it was true. But sitting there, listening to my character being dissected and questioned, I understood what Graham had meant about the trial being grueling. Marcus testified in his own defense, against the advice of his legal team. As I later learned, he was charming on the stand, just as he'd always been charming in life. He expressed regret for any misunderstandings, suggested that complex accounting had led to innocent errors, and implied that I had misinterpreted legitimate business activities as fraud. But under cross-examination, he faltered. The prosecution had the recordings, the emails, the financial trails that led inexorably to his guilt. When confronted with his own words, spoken in his own voice, his composure cracked. "You told your brother," and I quote, "everything I've done at the company, the client relationships I've built, The growth we've seen, that's me, not you, sitting in your office crunching numbers. What did you mean by that, Mr. Matthews? I was expressing frustration. Sibling stuff. It didn't mean anything. And when you said, I've proved him wrong now, haven't I? What were you referring to? Marcus hesitated. I watched his face, saw the calculation happening, the desperate search for an explanation that would save him. I don't remember the context. Let me refresh your memory. The prosecutor played more of the recording, Marcus's voice filling the courtroom, bitter and revealing. By the time it finished, the jury's faces told the story. The verdict came on the 8th day of the trial. Guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 1 count of money laundering, 2 counts of forgery. The judge set sentencing for a month later, but the outcome was clear. My brother was going to prison. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt that justice had been served. Instead, I felt empty, hollowed out by a process that had stripped away any remaining illusions about family, loyalty, and love. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks after the verdict. I debated whether to attend, whether I wanted to see my brother standing before a judge, waiting to learn how many years of his life would be taken. Sarah thought I should go, that I needed the closure. My therapist, whom I'd started seeing midway through the trial, disagreed. What do you hope to gain from witnessing the sentencing? She'd asked. Satisfaction? Revenge? Vindication? I don't know. Maybe just an ending. There may not be an ending, Daniel, not in the way you're hoping. Some wounds don't close. They just become part of who you are. In the end, I went. I sat in the back of the courtroom, out of Marcus's direct line of sight, and watched the final act of our brotherhood play out. The judge was thorough in his remarks. He acknowledged Marcus's lack of prior criminal history, his apparent remorse, and the character witnesses who had spoken on his behalf. But he also emphasized the severity of the offense, the breach of trust involved, and the calculating nature of the crime. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, he said. This was a systematic campaign of theft and deception carried out against a victim who had shown the defendant nothing but generosity and trust. The defendant exploited family bonds for personal gain and in doing so caused immense financial and emotional damage. The sentence was 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 3. Marcus would serve his time in a Category C prison, which Graham explained was reserved for inmates who posed less of a security risk. It wasn't the harshest sentence possible, but it was significant. 3 years, at minimum, in which my brother would wake up in a cell, eat institutional food, and contemplate the choices that had brought him there. Marcus was led away without looking back. I sat in my seat until the courtroom emptied, then walked out into the grey London afternoon and felt, for the first time in months, something close to peace. But the legal process, as it turned out, was only the beginning of the aftermath. The civil case proceeded in parallel with the criminal proceedings and reached its conclusion a few months after Marcus's sentencing. The judge ordered the recovery of all stolen funds, plus damages and legal costs. Since Marcus had no assets beyond what he'd hidden in Claire's shell companies, this meant liquidating everything they owned. Their house was sold. Claire's modest savings were seized. The Rolex was auctioned, along with other luxury items Marcus had purchased with my money. Claire divorced him before he'd served his first year. She contacted me once, through a lawyer, to ask if I would be willing to provide a statement confirming she had been unaware of the fraud. I consulted with Graham, who advised that such a statement might be used to shield her from civil liability. In the end, I agreed to provide a limited statement, acknowledging that the evidence didn't suggest her active participation. It was, I suppose, my one act of mercy in the whole affair. My mother didn't speak to me for nearly 2 years. The silence was painful, but I understood it. In her mind, I had destroyed her son, regardless of what that son had done. Grandchildren can be powerful bridges, though, and eventually, Emma and Jack's persistent requests for visits with Grandma Helen wore down her resistance. We began a cautious reconciliation, never speaking directly about Marcus, maintaining a careful neutrality that was fragile but functional. The company survived, as I'd always known it would. The publicity around the trial had actually generated some unexpected interest from investors who saw my handling of the situation as evidence of integrity and resilience. We grew by 20% in the year following the verdict, launched 2 new development projects, and hired additional staff. I promoted Robert to the board of directors and implemented new financial controls that would make any future fraud much harder to accomplish. But even as the external circumstances improved, I struggled with internal wounds that refused to heal. The therapist was right. There was no clean ending. I found myself looking at people differently, questioning motives, waiting for betrayal. When a new employee performed exceptionally well, my first instinct was suspicion rather than praise. When friends offered support, I wondered what they wanted in return. Sarah noticed, as she noticed everything. She didn't push me to talk about it, but she created spaces where I could, and eventually I began to open up about the fundamental damage Marcus had done to my ability to trust. "It's not just about him," I told her one night. "It's about everyone. If my own brother could do this, anyone could. How am I supposed to believe in people anymore? You believe in me? You're different. Why? Because I've proven myself over 15 years? Marcus had proven himself too. Or so you thought. What makes me different from any other potential betrayer?" I didn't have an answer. The question haunted me for months, until I finally arrived at something close to an understanding. Trust, I realized, wasn't about certainty. It was about choice. I chose to trust Sarah, not because I had proof she would never betray me, but because life without that trust would be hollow and fearful. The same logic applied to others, to friends, to employees, to the world in general. Trust was a risk I had to take, even knowing the cost if I was wrong. It wasn't a complete healing. I don't know if complete healing is possible after what happened. But it was a framework I could work within, a way to function without being paralyzed by suspicion. Marcus was released after 3 years and 2 months, having been granted parole for good behavior. I learned about it from Graham, who had arranged to be notified of any changes in my brother's status. There were conditions to his release, including restrictions on his ability to work in finance or handle other people's money. For all practical purposes, his career was over. I didn't attend the release hearing. I didn't try to make contact. As far as I was concerned, my brother had ceased to exist on the day he was arrested, and nothing that happened afterward could change that. But Marcus apparently had other ideas. About 6 months after his release, I received a letter. Not an email, not a phone call, but an actual handwritten letter, sent to my office with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, slightly messier than it had been, perhaps affected by 3 years of disuse. I almost threw it away unread. What could he possibly say that would matter? What justification? What excuse? What plea for forgiveness could change what had happened? But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, made me open the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long, densely written, clearly the product of considerable thought. I'll summarize its contents because reading it in full would take more emotional energy than I'm willing to spend even now. Marcus began by acknowledging what he had done, not minimizing, not deflecting, but actually naming his crimes and taking responsibility for them. He described his gambling addiction, which had started small and grown into a monster he couldn't control. He talked about the envy he'd felt toward me since childhood, how it had poisoned his perception of our relationship and made him see enemies where there were only family. He discussed his time in prison, the therapy he'd received there, the slow and painful process of understanding how he'd become someone capable of betraying his own brother. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said explicitly that he knew he didn't deserve it and wasn't seeking it. What he wanted, he wrote, was simply to tell me that he understood now what he'd done, and that the understanding had changed him. He was living in a small flat in the north, working a menial job, attending regular meetings for recovering gamblers. He had no plans to return to London or to contact me again unless I wanted him to. The letter ended with a single sentence. "I'm sorry for everything I took from you, but mostly for taking your trust in me." I read it 3 times, then put it in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But the words stayed with me, surfacing at unexpected moments, prompting questions I didn't want to answer. Was I obligated to respond? Could people really change in the fundamental way Marcus described? And if he was telling the truth, if he genuinely understood and regretted what he'd done, did that change anything about my own feelings? Sarah found the letter a few weeks later while looking for something in my desk. She read it without asking permission, which under other circumstances might have annoyed me, but she knew me well enough to understand why I'd kept it. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know." "That's not an answer." "I know." I took the letter back, folded it carefully. Part of me wants to believe him, wants to believe that everything he wrote is true, and that he's really become a different person. But another part of me thinks it's just another manipulation. Another scheme to get back into my life so he can take something else. Which part is stronger? I thought about it for a long moment. The second part. But I'm not sure if that's wisdom or just self-protection. Maybe they're the same thing. I didn't respond to the letter. I couldn't. The risk was too great, and the potential reward too uncertain. Whatever Marcus had become in prison, whatever growth or change he'd experienced, it couldn't erase what he'd done. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. But I kept the letter. I still have it, in fact, in a folder with all the other documents from that period of my life. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I take it out and read it again, trying to decide if I made the right choice. The question of whether revenge was worth it, whether any of it was worth it, has no simple answer. I got my money back, or most of it. I protected my company. I saw my brother face consequences for his actions. By any objective measure, I won. But winning came with costs that no amount of recovery could repay. My relationship with my mother was permanently damaged, a careful detente rather than the genuine connection we'd had before. My ability to trust was impaired, perhaps forever. The family I'd grown up in, the shared history and holidays and memories, all of it was tainted now, colored by the knowledge of what Marcus had been planning even as we sat around Christmas dinner together. And there was a darker question, one I rarely allowed myself to ask directly. Had I played any role in creating the monster my brother became? His complaints about being in my shadow, about always being compared unfavorably, those weren't entirely unfounded. I had succeeded where he failed. I had been praised where he was overlooked. I hadn't done it deliberately, hadn't sought to diminish him, but the effect was real nonetheless. Did that shared history give him some claim to grievance, even if his actions in response were inexcusable? The therapist helped me work through these questions, slowly, over months of sessions. Her conclusion, which I eventually came to share, was that understanding someone's motivations didn't require accepting their behavior. Marcus had real reasons for his envy and resentment. Those reasons explained his actions, but didn't justify them. I bore some responsibility for the dynamic between us, but that responsibility ended when he chose to steal and deceive. His choices were his own, and so were the consequences. It's been 4 years now since Marcus was released from prison. I've heard nothing from him beyond that one letter. From occasional updates through mutual acquaintances, I know he's still living in the North, still working a regular job, still apparently following the conditions of his parole. Whether he's truly changed, truly become the person he described in his letter, I have no way of knowing. My mother passed away last year, peacefully, in her sleep. At the funeral, I saw Marcus for the first time since the trial. He stood at the back of the chapel, alone, wearing a suit that had seen better days. We didn't speak, but our eyes met for a moment across the rows of mourners, and I saw something in his expression that might have been sorrow or regret, or simply the weight of all the years and all the damage. He left before the reception, without approaching anyone. I don't know if he was following the terms of his parole, which might still prohibit contact with me, or simply respecting boundaries he knew couldn't be crossed. Either way, it was the closest thing to a reunion we'll ever have. I'm 50 now. Emma is in university, studying architecture, talking about joining the family business one day. Jack is finishing school, already showing more natural aptitude for development than I ever had at his age. Sarah and I are closer than ever. Our marriage strengthened rather than weakened by the trials we've faced together. The company continues to grow. We've expanded into sustainable development, a new passion of mine, building homes that minimize environmental impact while maximizing livability. It's good work. Meaningful work, the kind of legacy I want to leave behind. When I walk through one of our completed projects and see families moving in, children running through rooms I helped design, I feel a satisfaction that no amount of money could provide. But there are still nights when I lie awake thinking about Marcus, about the brother he used to be, the enemy he became, and the stranger he is now. I wonder if he thinks about me too, if he looks back on what he did with genuine remorse, or just the frustration of having been caught. I wonder if there's a parallel universe somewhere in which things went differently, in which we stayed brothers in more than just blood. There probably isn't. The choices we made, both of us, led us here. And here is where I have to live. What have I learned from all of this? That trust is precious and easily broken, that the people closest to you have the greatest power to hurt you, and sometimes they use it. That revenge, even when justified, leaves scars on the one who takes it as well as the one who suffers it. And that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, only accepting. I've told this story now, for the first time in its entirety, because I believe it might help someone else. Someone who suspects that someone close to them is not what they seem. Someone who's faced betrayal and doesn't know how to respond. Someone who's wondering whether the bonds of family are strong enough to survive anything. They're not. That's the hard truth I've lived. Love and blood and shared history can all be overcome by greed and envy and resentment. The people we think we know best can be the ones we understand least. And when the mask finally slips, when the betrayal is revealed, the person you thought you loved may turn out to have never existed at all. But here's the other truth, the one that took me longer to learn. Surviving that betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. You can choose to let it define you, to spend the rest of your life bitter and suspicious and closed off from others. Or you can choose to treat it as one chapter in a longer story, a chapter that hurt but didn't end you. I chose the second option. It wasn't easy. There were days, months even, when I wasn't sure I'd made the right choice. But looking at my life now, at my family, my work, the person I've become, I know that Marcus's betrayal, as devastating as it was, didn't win. He took my trust, my money, my sense of security, but he couldn't take my future. That was mine to build, and I built it anyway. The brother I grew up with is gone. Maybe he was always gone, and I just didn't see it. What remains is memory, complicated and painful, and the knowledge that I did what I had to do. I protected my family, I sought justice, I reclaimed my life. And if Marcus is out there somewhere, reading this, knowing that these words are about him, I want him to understand one thing. I don't hate you anymore. I don't love you either. What I feel is something more like distance, the emotional equivalent of looking at a photograph of someone you used to know. You were my brother once. Now you're just someone who used to be. That's not forgiveness. It's not reconciliation. It's simply the truth. Some people might say, I should have handled it differently, should have confronted him privately, given him a chance to explain, tried to find some path that didn't end in courtrooms and prison cells. Maybe they're right. Maybe there was a better way that I was too hurt or too angry to see. But I did what I thought was right. I did what felt necessary to protect everything I built and everyone I loved. And given the same circumstances, facing the same evidence of betrayal, I would probably do it again. That's the final truth of this story, the one I'll leave you with. When someone you trust completely turns out to be your enemy, you have a choice to make. You can pretend it isn't happening, hoping they'll change or the situation will resolve itself. You can try to accommodate them, giving ground until there's nothing left to give. Or you can fight back with everything you have and accept that the relationship is already lost. I chose to fight. It cost me my brother, but it might have saved everything else. And in the end, that's the trade I had to make. The story doesn't have a neat ending because life doesn't have neat endings. Marcus is still out there, living his diminished life. I'm still here, building mine. Our mother is gone, and whatever reconciliation might have happened through her is no longer possible. The family we grew up in exists only in memory now, and even those memories are colored by what came later. But I have Sarah. I have Emma and Jack. I have work that matters and friends who've proven themselves. I have a future that Marcus tried to take but couldn't. And I have the knowledge that when the worst thing I could imagine happened, I found the strength to face it. That's not nothing. In fact, it might be everything. My name is Daniel Matthews. My brother turned into my enemy, and I survived. This is my story, and I'm still writing the chapters that come next.